there was a marker there for which I hadn't noticed, I couldn't understand, for John Fox. It said USA, Exército, Army, USA Army, who died on the same day, which was the 26th of December, 1944. And when I asked everybody in the village, but nobody knew who he was.
An excerpt from today's guest, who's written a book about Black World War II Medal of Honor recipient John Fox. Author Solace Wales is here, and we'll speak to her right after this break. I'm Robert Child, and this is Point of the Spear. Welcome back. Today's guest's interest in World War II era Italy was sparked at age 19 when she was a Smith College junior year abroad student in Siena and Florence. After college, she had a long career as a children's art educator. Her current book is called Braided in Fire, and author Solace Wales joins us now. Solace, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled because, as you know, we communicated over the summer, and I want to tell the listeners that your book was so invaluable to me in researching my book, Immortal Valor, and the story of Medal of Honor recipient John Fox. The work you've done in Braided in Fire is just outstanding, and I just want to let people know that.
Okay, well, thank you.
It is. You're a very dogged researcher.
Well, it's over a long period of time, very long period of time.
Yeah, I know. Now, this was the first history book you've written. What motivated you to tell this story?
It's kind of a long story how I got into it. My husband and I bought a ruin of a house in a tiny village in the foothills of the Apennines in Italy. And I became passionate about anything to do with this village that became our adopted village. We spent, long periods, like 4 months a year there. And starting in 1975. And I began hearing occasionally from my neighbors some daunting stories about what they had been through in the Second World War. And I was always really interested. But the minute they stopped talking, it vanished from my consciousness, because here we were in this very bucolic peasant village that was still functioning as a contadino Italian village. And it was it was beautiful, and there were the prize. I simply couldn't envision modern warfare with mortars and machine guns in these beautiful gardens with their vegetable abundance and lovely geraniums, and the kind of gentle life of the old peasant way. It just didn't compute. So it was a long time before I finally saw some of the elders die and realized that their stories, each of which was individual, were being lost. So finally, in 1987, I went next door to my bedridden 90-year-old neighbor and her daughter, who was in her late 60s then, I guess, and began doing oral history with them. And when I started this, and then it expanded, and I basically interviewed everyone in the village who was old enough to have remembered World War II. And I then realized how much larger this story was than I knew. But I still didn't know who John Fox was. And he was a motivation in the sense that in 1980, I found this marker in the village little monument to Martiri della Resistenza, which are the martyrs of the resistance movement. They were partisan fighters who were helping the Allies who died in the village. And there was a little monument for them, but there was a marker there for which I hadn't noticed, I couldn't understand, for John Fox. Said USA, Exército, the Army, USA Army, who died on the same day, which was the 26th of December, 1944. And when I asked everybody in the village, but nobody knew who he was. And though I knew that most of the soldiers who had been in the village on that date were Black, in fact, all of them were Black, I found out later, I didn't know if this was African American or a white American. I knew that the higher ranking soldiers in that area were white, so I didn't. This was a lieutenant, So I just didn't know who Fox was, and I couldn't seem to find out. It wasn't until 1992 that I read in a recently published American military book a little brief description of Fox's action, and found out that he was indeed African American, and that motivated me finally to do what I knew I should have been doing all along, which is to try to find some of the Black vets who had been involved with Soma Colonia. But I had kind of dragged my feet on this because, first place, I didn't know how in the world I'd find them. But then I wondered why these vets would want to talk to me. Here's this woman who knows nothing about the military, and a white person with no direct experience of the prejudice that is so horrific in our society. And also, these would be painful memories, so why would they want to share them with me, But in fact, what happened was the response I received telephoning these men just out of the blue, because I was mainly on the phone calling all over the country, eliciting often upsetting memories. It was just an experience I'll never forget, because in fact I was greeted with extraordinary warmth and candor and patience. I mean, I had learned the main facts about what happened during the war in Italy from my neighbors who had had a fourth grade education, but who knew these facts viscerally and, were very good at instructing me. And then I learned from these vets all, about the organization of the military and the equipment and so on. And then afterwards, I read everything I could get my hands on that to do with in both Italian and English about the area of Soma Colonia. But very little was written directly about Soma Colonia, because you have to realize all the soldiers, the villagers had a very strong oral tradition, but not a written one. Mm-hmm. And then the soldiers, most of whom died in that battle, were also had a strong oral tradition, but they weren't keeping journals or so there was very little direct information particularly about this village, and so it did take a lot of research and a lot of questions, and trying and finding out, mainly from first-hand sources.
Yeah, the majority of the soldiers involved did die in that battle. I think only 17 soldiers.
Yeah, escaped. Well, you asked what motivated me to tell the story. I was passionate, of course, about this village. But then once I learned from talking to the vets about the extraordinary myriad ways that they suffered prejudice in the U.S. Army of those times, I wanted to contribute in some way, however small, to pointing out the unfairness of the prejudice in our society. Mm-hmm. So this became an accompanying passion, along with the history of my beloved village. So two motivating things, and it was a good thing I had them, because it took 30 years.
Yeah, I know. But in that time, you discovered many things that hadn't been reported. Let's go back to you mentioned the Italian partisans.
Right.
Can you paint a picture of the partisans and how vital they were to the Americans fighting alongside?
Well, in the village at the time of the battle, there were approximately 25 partisans. And there were about 75 of Black Americans of the 366 Infantry, 366 Infantry Regiment. Right. So the 25 partisans, about 8 of them were stationed at the very top of the village on this little hillock next to a path leading down from the German encampment, which was only a mile and a half uphill. On this path, and it was Soma Colonia is at a high elevation. It's a little village. It's 2,300 feet, but Lama, the encampment where the Germans were, is at 3,000 feet, and so with both of them have very expansive views of the Serchio Valley and sort of strategic points, but it's so close to this major German encampment. And also, Somacolonia was the most northern point. Anyway, the eight partisans who were on this little hillock defended the village when it was attacked initially before dawn at about 5 in the morning. They were very good at stopping that initial attack, and it was helped by Fox directing artillery fire too, right. You know, just beyond where they were. So, and they continued. They stayed at that point and continued to defend the village from that point, which made it a little harder for the Germans, of course, to pursue the attack. And then there were partisans elsewhere in the village who fought valiantly as well.
February is Black History Month, and my new book, Immortal Valor, about the Black Medal of Honor recipients of World War II, is out now. The book chronicles these immortal heroes' life journeys through all the pain and struggle up until their ultimate triumphs. I hope you check out the book to discover more as we celebrate Black History Month. Just visit my website at robchild.net or visit any online retailer. Now back to the conversation. Let's delve deeper into the history of John Fox. You're probably the only author who's dug this deep into his history, and you've corrected many of the accepted facts about his actions in the battle. What were some of the major errors or misconceptions that you discovered?
Well, there were a number of them, but it's because partly the people who were writing about this, there was little written, and most of them, of course, didn't speak Italian, and so there wasn't a connection with Italian sources before I started this, you see, because I was asking Italians too, and that was, I think, one of the major differences. And also because the Foxes didn't receive any medal until the Distinguished Service Cross. That was in 1982, and that's where what's stated in the citation in the Medal of Honor was the same as was in the 1982 Distinguished Service Cross citation. And you have to realize that was put together 35 years after the fact, and right. Only from American sources, you see. And so there were a lot of mistakes in it once I started really looking into it. The location of Fox's outpost, where he was when he made his dramatic call for artillery fire onto his own location. According to the citation, he was in the second story of a house. Well, that mistake came from his great friend Otis Zachary, who had been in Somacolonia and had been the forward observer in Somacolonia, and he was in the second story of a house. So he had the coordinates to shoot at Fox's OP, but he thought it was the same location, and that's where the misinformation must have come from, you see, because he was, of course, interviewed by the committee. Then there was even a mistake about where the Cannon Company was when Zachary received this dramatic call. Then came this call from his best friend saying, you need to fire at my location now. and Zachary said, no, I can't do that. And he called the colonel over, his commanding colonel, and the colonel said, listen, you know what you're doing, John, and Fox said, it has to be done now, and insisted. So anyway, it happened, as we all know, and that the cannons were fired at Fox's location at the OP. All right, well, Zachary thought at the time that the Cannon Company that both he and Fox were with was in a town called Gallicano, okay? And because I interviewed Zachary, and this was such a huge thing in his life, I was certain that he knew where he was, okay? That he was in Gallicano. And whereas all other sources said that the Cannon Company was in Lopia, where the other batteries were, all right? But Zachary insisted And I went to great lengths to prove that 55 millimeter cannons, which they had the range. I called up this commanding um, colonel who said he was 90 something and had a very soft voice, but he could remember the precise range, and that was within range. But then all people told me that even in Italy the Italian experts said, well, no, the cannon would have been north facing, and they wouldn't have had time to change it because it's difficult to change the direction of a cannon. Mm-hmm. But I found out that the 55 millimeter cannons could be quickly changed because they were particular, and so I believed this for 18 years, and then up came this morning report showing that Cannon Company was indeed in Lopia. So you see, it took a long time to sort out some of these things.
Cross-checking, yeah.
Yeah.
I believe they were 105 millimeter cannons.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you.
They were towed. I'll get to Zachary in a moment, but you were able to attend the White House ceremony, the Medal of Honor ceremony, with Fox's widow, Arlene Fox. Can you share some of the atmosphere on that day?
Oh, right, yes. Well, it was absolutely extraordinary, actually. It was really an amazing event. There was mostly an African-American audience, but, and there were the members of the cabinet and General Colin Powell and all the, military brass. But everyone present seemed conscious that the implications of this occasion went beyond the importance of the military honoring. There was a feeling that we all knew that our country was finally able to admit its mistake in withholding acknowledgement of Black soldiers. President Clinton at the time was really superb on this occasion. And, when he said history has been made whole today, it had some weight. And the mood was generally, reverent and emotional. In the back, of course, there was this huge array of TV cameras and so on. But towards the end, there was this moment of silence. It was just natural. Nobody said we're going to be silent. But there was this moment of silence in this jammed room, but it was a silence that felt really joyous. It was quite wonderful.
I have a photo of that in my forthcoming book of everyone's heads bowed, like they're in prayer or a moment of silence. So you're saying that no one said we're going to have a moment of silence. It just was silent. It was amazing. That is amazing. Now, accompanying you to the White House that day was Fox's good friend Otis Zachary. And can you share some of why he was so anguished over Fox's death?
Yes, well, of course, I met Zachary at the White House events, but I already knew him. It's surprising how well you can get to know someone over the telephone. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. But he was just as I expected. And, he sort of a jokester, but anyway, he was having to order the cannons fired at his best friend was, of course, agonizing for him. But then that was on 26th of December, 1944. Then when Fox's body was finally brought down from Soma Colonia, around January 1st or so, seeing him was very haunting for Zachary. He had loaned his friend John his field jacket for the frontline duty because John only had dress uniforms, and it was the body was just almost unrecognizable, riddled with shot and everything, and the locket that he wore around his neck with Arlene's photo, his wife's photo, and his college ring, were gone, and his good boots, of course, had disappeared. He couldn't help but think, but that could have been me, because if Fox had not volunteered for that Christmas time duty, it would have been Zachary up there in Soma Colonia. When he was ordered to perform a saturation shelling of the town of Gallicano, he went a bit mad. His superiors had told him that no civilians would be left in town there in Gallicano. and except civilians who were collaborators. Anyway, the morning after he did this, Italian civilians passed by him, old people and children hobbling along, and Zachary, seeing them, they were wounded and bleeding, and Zachary, seeing them, felt like he was the devil incarnate. I mean, he was so devastated seeing these people in that shape. And he said, well, why didn't they leave? There'd been many, they dropped many pamphlets about how the civilians had to get out of the town. He said, well, why didn't they leave? And his friend next to him, by this time he was crying. The friend next to him said, well, they only have their houses. They don't have any money. They don't have any transportation. They don't know where to go, And so anyway, he really couldn't get over having done that. And later, he never told anyone actually about this, not even his wife. And he told me, I believe, because he wanted, at the end of his life, he wanted people to know how he had suffered his whole life because of this mistake, And of course, it's unknown what the results of his using WP was. It may have caused little damage, actually, because it was nighttime and the people were all inside, probably in their basements, for the safest place. So the wounds that he observed may not have been because he used WP. But anyway, he really suffered because of this fact.
I see, yeah.
And had a hard time facing Gallicano when he came to Soma Colonia in 2000 for the ceremony that honored the Black veterans.
So he was able to return.
Yes, he came in 2000 to this wonderful event hosted by the village and the local commune, and I encouraged the veterans that I had spoken with, to come to this event, and it was really quite extraordinary.
Fox's widow attended.
Yes, she was a very remarkable woman and so wonderfully able to meet, there were all these reporters, hounding her, and she was so succinct and able to say what was important. I remember at the White House, they asked her what does this mean for your family? She said, I think it goes way beyond the meaning for our family. It has to do with if a man performs his duty, it doesn't matter the color of his skin,
Absolutely. It sounds like she was very poised, and I spoke with her daughter on the phone. I guess she had earned the moniker of small but mighty.
Yes, that's right. She was minute. I mean, that was the only surprise when I met her. She still had a Boston accent, although she was living in Texas then with Sandra. And but powerful. But then when I met her, I knew she was so just barely 5 feet, I think.
The book is called Braided in Fire, and I highly recommend people go out and purchase it. Solace, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, I enjoyed it, and it's great to meet you, and I'm looking forward to your book.
That's it for this episode. Thanks again for joining me. My conversation with Solace is part of a series of shows this month focused on the 7 Black Medal of Honor recipients of World War II and my book, Immortal Valor, which comes out tomorrow in the UK and January 11th in the United States. Our next episode will continue that focus as I speak with author Aline Carter, who is the daughter-in-law of Sergeant Edward Carter, one of the Medal of Honor recipients.
History will never be able to talk about Sergeant Carter unless they tell his story. They can't bury it anymore. His story will always be told, and that's why I appreciate so much what you're doing to keep this going.
That's next time. And it's the first of 2 episodes with Aline Carter that you won't want to miss. And if you like what you hear, leave a review or a rating or just click the follow button. You can find me on Twitter @RobChild, where you can share your comments about the show. I'm Robert Child, and this has been Point of the Spear.
Music licensed from audioblocks.com. Point of the Spear is produced by RSC Media Group.